The baby's cry was not loud, but it was relentless, sharp enough to pierce through exhaustion, fear, and the fragile walls of a man already on the edge. Haris Qadri sat on the edge of his worn-out sofa in the dim daylight filtering through thin curtains, his hands trembling as he tried to soothe his son. The tiny infant, barely 3 months old, writhed in his arms, face red, mouth open in a silent scream between cries. The bottle beside him was empty. Completely empty. And so was everything else. Haris hadn't slept properly in days. His eyes were sunken, his beard unkempt, his shirt stained with milk and sweat. Life had collapsed around him so quietly that he didn't even realize when survival became the only goal. Just a few months ago, he had been an ordinary man with an ordinary life, a modest job at a repair shop, a small apartment, and dreams that felt within reach. But then came the accident that took his wife, Sana, just days after giving birth. Since then, Haris had been drifting, trying to learn how to be both mother and father, while grief sat heavy on his chest like a weight he couldn't shake off. Now, as his son cried helplessly in his arms, Haris felt something inside him crack. He checked his wallet again, though he already knew what he'd find: nothing. Not even enough for a single can of baby formula. His phone lay beside him, an old device with a cracked screen, and he picked it up with shaking fingers. He had already called everyone he knew. Friends had stopped answering. Relatives had offered sympathy, not help. His pride had been stripped away piece by piece, until all that remained was desperation. If you believe in kindness and second chances, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel Echoes of Stories. Because sometimes, even the smallest act of compassion can change a life forever. Haris stared at the keypad for a long moment before typing in a number. It wasn't someone he knew. It wasn't even a number he recognized. It was just random. A last, fragile attempt at hope when logic had already failed him. His heart pounded as he pressed the call button, each ring echoing louder than his thoughts. He almost hung up, ashamed of what he was about to do, but then the call connected. On the other end of the line was Areeba Siddiqui, standing near the glass window of her high-rise office apartment, overlooking a bright daytime city buzzing with life. She had just stepped away from a meeting, her phone vibrating in her hand. Unknown number. Normally, she would ignore it. But something made her answer. What followed was not a conversation she expected. Haris's voice came out broken, hesitant, barely holding together as he stumbled over his words. He explained his situation, not dramatically, not with rehearsed emotion, but with raw honesty that felt almost painful to hear. He told her about his baby, about the empty bottle, about not having even $50 to buy formula. He apologized repeatedly, as if his desperation itself was a crime. Areeba didn't interrupt. She didn't question. She simply listened. She had spent years building her life into something structured, successful, and controlled. As a financial consultant, she was used to numbers, logic, and decisions that made sense. But this call, it didn't fit into any category she understood. It was messy, emotional, and real in a way that shook something inside her. She looked out at the bright city below, people walking, cars moving, life going on as usual, and for the first time in a long while, it all felt distant. Somewhere out there, a man was holding his hungry child, calling a stranger because he had nowhere else to turn. Without overthinking, Areeba made a decision. She asked for his address. Haris hesitated. Trust didn't come easily anymore. But something in her voice, steady, calm, and sincere, made him believe her. He gave her the details, unsure of what would happen next, unsure if anything would happen at all. What he didn't expect was the sound of a knock on his door less than an hour later. When Haris opened it, the daylight spilled into his dim apartment, and there stood Areeba, dressed in a simple gray suit, holding a bag filled with baby supplies. Formula, bottles, diapers, more than he had hoped for, more than he could afford to dream about. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, and his eyes filled with tears he had been holding back for far too long. She didn't say much. She simply handed him the bag and gave a small nod, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. But to Horace, it wasn't normal. It was a miracle. Days turned into weeks, and something unexpected began to grow between them, not romance, not immediately, but a quiet understanding. Areeba started checking in, at first out of concern, then out of something deeper she couldn't quite explain. She would visit during the day, bringing small things, offering advice, sometimes just sitting in silence while Horace fed his son. Horace, on the other hand, began to change. The man who once felt completely broken started to find pieces of himself again. He cleaned his apartment. He shaved. He began looking for work, even if it meant starting from scratch. Each step was small, but each one mattered. The baby, whom he named Xavier, began to grow stronger, his cries replaced with soft giggles that filled the apartment with a kind of warmth Horace thought he had lost forever. But life doesn't change overnight, and challenges don't disappear just because hope appears. Horace struggled to find stable work. Bills piled up. There were days when doubt crept back in, whispering that this fragile stability wouldn't last. Areeba faced her own battles. Her career demanded her time, her focus, her energy. Helping Horace was not something she had planned, and yet it had become something she couldn't ignore. People around her questioned her choices, her priorities. They didn't understand why she would invest so much in someone she didn't even know. But Areeba knew something they didn't. She knew what it felt like to feel alone in a world full of people. She knew that sometimes, all it takes is one person to remind you that you matter. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the windows of Horace's apartment, he sat watching his son sleep peacefully. The room, once filled with despair, now carried a sense of calm. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But it was something. And for the first time in months, Horace allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps stories like these reach people who still believe in kindness. Before the story ends, take a moment to comment. Kindness still exists, if you believe even one small act can change someone's life. Because sometimes, a wrong number isn't a mistake. Sometimes, it's the exact connection the universe needed to make. And as Horace looked down at his son, gently holding his tiny hand, he realized something profound. He hadn't just asked for $50 that day. He had unknowingly asked for a second chance, and somehow, against all odds, he had received it.